Our boy Hans Niemann just busted out the Jobava London System against Grandmaster Vidit Gujrathi from their one-on-one 25-game blitz match. And I gotta say, this game of theirs was one of the craziest of the entire match. I mean, if you want to see an absolutely beautiful checkmating pattern, you gotta watch until the end to see how this happens, because Hans Niemann virtually gets forced checkmated, and it is... I don't want to ruin it for you, but just stick around and see how it goes. All right, in the game, Hans Niemann goes for the Jobava London System. Of course, that is where you start knight c3 with the Verisov, and then you go bishop f4. Now, what's the idea here? Well, white kind of has two main threats. The first one, very obvious, is the move knight to b5, trying to gang up on that c7 pawn. Now, black has various ways of defending that. Knight a6, defending the pawn. He can also go moves like a7, a6, blocking b5, or c6, blocking b5. And that's one idea. The other idea is, of course, queen d2, then castle queenside. And from there, you kind of just chuck the pawns up the board, try to attack black and blow them off the board. You know, not a bad strategy in blitz. It tends to work pretty well, even at the grandmaster level. So, all right, what does Vidit do? Well, Vidit has a lot of options. The main moves typically are e6, a6, c6, stuff like that. Instead, he goes for the move h6. Huh, all right. Well, yeah, I don't get this move at all. Okay, typically h6 blocks bishop g5, but white already committed bishop f4. And what is that doing? I mean, come on, Vidit. I'm only rated 2000. I don't know these Jedi mind tricks too well. All right, e3 from Hans, and then a6. Okay, this move makes at least a little bit of sense. You are blocking knight b5 from Hans Niemann. So, all right, a6 on the board. And now Hans Niemann, h4. Here we go. We're just going to attack in this game. Nothing makes any sense. And finally, the first move of the game that makes sense to me as an amateur player trying to commentate at the GM level. We got c5. Okay, I get that. You attack in the center. And if white takes the pawn, you just go knight c6, then bishop g4, putting pressure on the knight, trying to go e5. All right, some classical chess, some stuff I can understand. Here we go. And now Hans Niemann plays a really bad mistake. Bishop e2. The problem with this move is black gets literally everything he wants. He chops off the knight, then he goes e5, hitting the bishop, and once you retreat, you go e4, hitting again, and then you take the pawn with the bishop. I mean, this is just brutal stuff from Vidit. I mean, you got the pawn center, you got the bishop on the good diagonal, your knights are perfectly placed, you castle. I mean, white's, what is this pawn on h4 doing in this structure? I mean, absolutely zero. So this whole sequence of moves, just like, it's just easy mode for black. Instead of bishop e2, what you have to do is the move queen d2. What's the idea? Well, you let black take the knight, but here it's not so bad. You have the g file attacking the black king. I mean, that g1 square is perfect for the rook. And yes, black can do his cheeky little plan of e5 and taking the pawn, but then you go long castle, simply castles long, and black really can't castle long in response because the c pawn isn't there. That's just too weak. And castling kingside means this rook on g1 is going to be a monster. And, you know, Hans Niemann gets an attack. Of course, that is not the end of the story. The computer loves this move, queen a5. The idea is rook to d8. And if you go knight takes d5 first, then it just goes to insane, crazy chess. Queen takes a2. And this whole line here is just kind of ridiculous. The pieces fly off the board. Checks are given. And in the end, the computer says we have a dead level position. I mean, 0.00, criminy, just crazy chess. You got the king in the middle of the board, but it's somehow equal. All right, back to the game. Bishop e2, then that long sequence of the forced moves. Kicking both bishops, taking the pawn, and here black is just clearly better, clearly in control. All right, what does Hans Niemann do? He starts queen d2. It's the best square for the queen because It's the only square for the queen. Obviously, d3 and d4, not options here. Now, queen a5. The idea is getting that rook on the d8 file, and suddenly the queen and the rook are going to be super active. All right, castles, and then d4 from Vidit. The idea is transforming the pawn structure. This pawn on d4 could be a weakness. So instead of sticking around and finding out, you just trade the pawn, then bishop takes d4, and here after rook a to d1, rook a to d8, this is a good time to talk strategy. So what the heck is going on here? Well, pawn structure wise, white has the extra c pawn and black has the extra e pawn in the middle of the board. For right now, that pawn is very well defended by the knight. So black has the better central control. His minor pieces are better placed overall. I mean, yes, white does have the bishop pair, but for right now, they're not doing a whole lot. Black's knights are doing quite a bit in the center. And as far as king safety, I gotta say this move h2, h4 is backfiring. It wasn't a bad idea on move 5, but here it's kind of a weakness. Black is just gonna castle queenside, and from here, black just has a very good game. Vidit Gujrathi is in control. But of course, Hans Niemann is a fighter. He's not going down without a fight. He starts the attack, queen f4. The idea is you're activating the queen. Of course, bishop takes f2 was the threat. Then you take the queen. That would not be good. So queen f4 is forced. And now the computer loves the idea of g7 to g5. The idea is the queen defends the pawn. And the only good square for the queen here is going to be c7. But then you just trade the queens. Queen c7, trade the queen, take the queen. And here, black gets a better endgame. So that would have been a very good option from Vidit, g7, g5. Instead, bishop takes c3. That is a curious looking move. Okay, obviously Hans Niemann takes the rook, queen takes, then b takes c3. Okay, in this position, Vidit basically gave up his bishop in order to damage white's pawn structure. Now white has, of course, 3 pawn islands, and his pawn on h4 is still weak. However, he has this bishop pair, and as the game opens up and as we attack on 2 sides of the board, these bishops are going to be very, very valuable. So overall, we have a very imbalanced double-edged fight ahead. Now, Hans Niemann starts rook b1, simply targeting the b pawn. Vidit goes b5, defending. Now queen e3. Now both sides start to regroup a little bit. And in this position, Hans Niemann goes queen c5. And this is where things get really, really bad really fast. All right, the problem here is Vidit was attacking the pawn on a2. And it's not a bluff. After queen c5, Vidit just takes the pawn. And white doesn't really have compensation for it. I mean, instead of that, there were a few moves. Rook d1 was good. c3 to c4, trying to blow open the queen side was good. But instead, queen c5, and now queen takes a2. Okay, now Vidit attacks the rook. Here, Hans Niemann finds the best move. Rook to e1, simply defending the rook and the bishop. The problem with, say, rook d1 in this position is then after queen takes c2, you're hitting the bishop with check. And white has to go king f1, but that just wasted tempo. Then black has enough time to go knight a5 to c4, and suddenly the knight getting into the game. All right, rook e1 on the board from Hans Niemann. Good move. And now the key question for Vidit: how do you reroute the knight into the game? Or do you defend it with like rook c8? Well, in the game, he finds a very creative solution. And that is the idea of knight d8 intending knight e6. Now, here the computer likes knight a5 to c4 more. It also likes rook c8. But in my opinion, knight d8, not a bad move at all. Very logical, especially in blitz. Now, queen b6 from Hans and knight e6. Vidit completes the idea. And from here, both sides start to regroup their pieces. Both sides start to attack a little bit. Vidit takes the c2 pawn. And here, Hans Niemann makes a fatal mistake. And when I say fatal, I mean like he is going to get effed up here. He takes this pawn on e4, but that is the wrong idea. Instead, you had to go queen takes a6, and here Hans Niemann is still in the game. Instead, rook takes e4, but that allows the brilliant move from Vidit, rook d1. The idea here is Vidit's threatening something like queen c1, and then it's ganging up on the bishop on f1. Of course, the queen and the knight also ganging up on the f2 pawn if that bishop ever moves. And here, there's just no easy way to defend the bishop. In the game, Hans takes the knight on g4. I mean, that is as good a move as any, but this creates a serious problem. Vidit just takes the bishop. Rook takes f1. Of course, the idea here is if the king takes, that is checkmate on the d1 square. The king has nowhere to go. So you do not take the rook. Instead, king h2, but then queen d1, and again, threatening checkmate in one move on the h1 square. So Hans Niemann gives the king a check, the knight retreats, and then he moves up with the king, but even that's not enough. Of course, the idea is after rook h1, you have the saving move, bishop to h2, but that does not stop the problems. Here, Vidit sacks the rook. Rook takes h2. The idea, if you take the rook, he takes the rook back on g4, and then Vidit's up a knight. Even if you take the pawns are level, but Vidit has a knight. That is game over. Okay, instead, he goes king g3. You do not take the rook. King g3 on the board. But now, the final blow of the game. Queen d6, the x-ray defending the rook. And here, Hans Niemann resigns on the spot. Of course, the idea is if you go rook f4, the only defense, then Vidit goes rook takes h4, and the rook is pinned to the king by the queen. And if you try to take the rook with the king, Vidit takes back. And again, Vidit is just up a knight. You have to check on the king. Oh, that is ugly. All right, Chess YouTube, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please smash that subscribe button. I'm about to break 100 subs as I say this, as I record this video, and I would love it if you would just give me some love and smash that button. And I'll see you in the next video.